As The Rock arrives at the hospital to pick up his sick daughter, he witnesses a horrifying scene. A racist cop, Officer Reynolds, pointing a gun at her as she sits helplessly in a wheelchair. The air turns ice cold as The Rock steps in, his rage barely contained. What happens next shakes the entire city, a brutal lesson in justice, power, and fear that Officer Reynolds will never forget. Subscribe and like this video to see how the story unfolds. In the bright, clear light of a summer day, St. Mary's Hospital basked in a radiant glow, its doors opening to reveal little Lily Johnson. Her frail body was swathed in a soft pink blanket, seated in a wheelchair. The Rock's 7-year-old daughter, once robust and energetic, had been waging a courageous battle against a life-threatening respiratory illness for weeks, her spirit never faltering despite the physical toll it had taken. Mrs. Carter, a woman whose wrinkles bore the evidence of a lifetime spent in the service of others, guided Lily's wheelchair with a tender yet firm hand. Her smile, as soft and warm as freshly baked cookies, was a constant source of comfort for the young girl. As she pushed her charge gently down the antiseptic hallways of St. Mary's Hospital, the bright light from the front entrance beckoned them like a beacon of hope. Lily's journey to recovery had been long and arduous, her small body weakened by the ravages of illness. A weak smile tugged at Lily's delicate lips, her once rosy cheeks now pale and shadowed by sickness. "I can't wait to go home," she whispered, her voice quavering like a fragile leaf caught in a light breeze. Mrs. Carter, her own heart straining with sympathy for the child, offered a soothing touch, patting Lily's small hand with the tenderness of a mother. "Your daddy will be here any minute, sweetheart," she reassured her, her voice carrying the weight of decades of maternal instinct. As Mrs. Carter wheeled the young girl toward the automatic doors, they slid open with a quiet whoosh, the crisp, warm air of a summer day rushing into the hospital's sterile interior. Lily, her face tilting skyward, allowed the rays of sunlight to envelop her, her young face alight with relief and joy. She inhaled deeply, savoring the taste of freedom and fresh air. For a brief, blissful moment, it seemed that all was well. But in the blink of an eye, the fragile peace was shattered. Just yards away, tucked neatly into a nearby parking space, Officer Reynolds' patrol car purred like a great, lazy predator. In the driver's seat, Reynolds' sharp jawline and cold, piercing eyes conveyed a certain disdain, a judgmental aloofness that colored his view of the world around him. And then, as his gaze fell upon Mrs. Carter and Lily, a serpentine shift occurred behind his eyes. His expression hardened, his brow furrowed, and an insidious darkness crept into his demeanor. Something about the pair had set him on edge. Prejudice, an insidious specter lurking in the dark recesses of Reynolds' mind, wove a tangled web of deception in his thoughts, shaping his perception like a blacksmith hammering a piece of steel. In the blink of an eye, Reynolds transformed from a silent observer to an aggressive instigator. He undid his seatbelt with a sharp snap, the sound reverberating across the parking lot like the crack of a whip. His belt holster, adjusted to be within easy reach, emphasized the dangerous authority in his steps as he strode purposefully towards Mrs. Carter. "Hey you," he barked, his cold, piercing eyes fixed on Mrs. Carter, his chest puffed out with an air of authority. The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, laden with implications and judgments that Mrs. Carter could not begin to fathom. She stopped in her tracks, her body freezing with confusion and a rising sense of dread. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice small and tentative. Officer Reynolds' eyes hardened, their icy depths narrowing into slits of suspicion. His hand, a snake coiled to strike, hovered near his gun, the holster creaking with tension. "What are you doing with that little girl?" he demanded, his voice a low growl, a threat thinly veiled as a question. Mrs. Carter's heart skipped a beat, the situation unfolding before her like a terrifying nightmare. "I'm her nanny, officer. She's just been discharged from the hospital. We're going home." Lily's body shrank into the soft embrace of the wheelchair, her small hands grasping tighter onto the pink blanket that had once provided comfort and warmth but now seemed more like a flimsy shield against the looming threat. She could not fathom the danger unfolding before her, her child's mind struggling to make sense of the tension in the air and the hostility radiating from Officer Reynolds. But even though she didn't fully understand, her instincts, sharp and primal as any animal's, screamed at her to be wary, to be afraid. Reynolds' sneer, a grotesque caricature of a smile, twisted his lips into a grimace of disdain. "Ah, and I suppose you expect me to believe that?" he mocked, his voice oozing with sarcasm. Mrs. Carter, her patience wearing thin like an old frayed rope, straightened her back and squared her shoulders, bracing herself for the confrontation. "Sir, I don't know what this is about, but I assure you." Reynolds' aggression escalated in a heartbeat. He lunged towards Lily's wheelchair, seizing its handles with a furious grip. Lily gasped, her small hands reflexively clutching the fabric of her blanket, her body recoiling from the perceived threat. Mrs. Carter, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest, reacted with a fury born of maternal instinct. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice a mix of anger and fear. But Reynolds, oblivious to the alarm he had sparked, stood unmoved, his jaw clenched and his eyes blazing. Reynolds' voice, like a serpent's hiss, slithered into the air with false authority. "She looks scared," he said, his gaze raking over Lily's trembling figure, his words tasting of falsehood. "I have reason to believe she's being kidnapped." The absurdity of the accusation, the sheer audacity of his manipulation, left Mrs. Carter momentarily speechless. She searched his face for any hint of humor, any sign that this was a sick joke. Lily, her voice quivering like a plucked violin string, mustered the courage to speak. Her small lips parted to utter a plea for reason. "I'm not kidnapped," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But her cries fell on deaf ears, swallowed by the echo of Reynolds' bloodlust. Then, just as Lily's predicament seemed hopeless, the rumbling of an approaching engine thundered through the air like a distant storm. With a screech of tires, a massive black Ford truck came to a skidding halt at the hospital entrance. The thunderous arrival heralded the appearance of none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson himself. His imposing frame oozing with the aura of raw power, the door swung open and he stepped out, his eyes burning with a fire that could rival the sun. In that instant, the world seemed to freeze, as if the very breath of time had been held captive by the intensity of the scene. The Rock stood like a statue of rage and fury, his eyes blazing like twin infernos as he took in the sight of his little girl trembling in fear, the taser hovering like the specter of death over her small frame. And then, like the unstoppable force of an avalanche, the Rock erupted into motion. Faster than a bullet from a gun, the Rock launched into action, his massive form surging forward with a speed that defied his size. With the brute force of a raging bull, his hand snatched Reynolds' wrist in an iron-like grip. The officer, caught off guard by the suddenness of the attack, had no time to react before the Rock's brute strength twisted his arm, eliciting a cry of agony from the now defenseless cop. The taser, its electric tendrils hissing with static, clattered to the ground like a discarded toy as the crowd erupted into a sea of shock and awe. Reynolds, desperate to reclaim his lost dignity, lunged for his baton, his hand grasping for the weapon like a drowning man lunging for a life raft. But in that moment, the Rock's fist connected with the officer's midsection. A blow so fierce and swift, it was as if the fist of Zeus had descended from the heavens. Reynolds, his eyes wide with shock and pain, stumbled backward into his patrol car, the air escaping his lungs in a sharp, pained gasp. Reynolds, winded and stunned by the force of the Rock's attack, braced himself against the patrol car, gasping for breath like a man drowning in his own pain. But his suffering was about to intensify as the Rock's fury, coiled like a serpent within him, was only beginning to uncoil. "You pointed a weapon at the Rock seethed, his voice low and seething with barely restrained rage. The Rock repeated his question, his words an enraged crescendo that echoed across the parking lot, carrying the weight of a father's fury and disbelief. "My 7-year-old daughter?" The Rock roared, his body tensed with primal fury, his eyes burning with a molten rage. "You pointed a weapon at my 7-year-old daughter?" Reynolds, his face contorted into a mask of fear, tried desperately to reach for his radio, a last-ditch effort to call for backup. But the Rock, relentless in his pursuit of justice for his child, caught the officer's uniform in his massive grip and slammed him against the patrol car with bone-crunching force. The sound of the impact, a reverberating thud that echoed through the parking lot like a thunderclap, seemed to freeze the surrounding bystanders in their tracks. They watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a titan of a man brought a bully to his knees. The Rock's iron grip held Reynolds aloft, the officer's face mere inches from the Rock's, his shaking legs supported only by the granite wall of the Rock's body. In that instant, Reynolds realized his own mortality, a taste of his impending doom lingering on his tongue like ash. "You feel powerful?" The Rock hissed, his breath hot against Reynolds' skin. "Threatening sick kids, is that what makes you feel like a man?" Face down on the hood of his patrol car, Reynolds' indignant cry for freedom only served to infuriate The Rock even more. "Get your hands off me!" Reynolds gasped, his voice muffled by the hard metal surface beneath him. The Rock's anger was now a molten rage, boiling over like a volcano on the brink of eruption. He leaned in close to Reynolds, his words a breathless whisper. The Rock's whispered threat rumbled with the weight of a warning, his face mere inches from the officer's. "You're lucky I'm a man of restraint," The Rock growled. "Because if I wasn't, if I let my rage run unchecked, you would be nothing more than a red stain on this parking lot." Reynolds trembled, his mind racing as he tried to devise a way out of this impossible situation. But The Rock was not done with him. Reynolds' fear was palpable, a living, breathing entity clawing at his throat, suffocating him with its stranglehold. The Rock's words, like a branding iron scorching its mark into flesh, seared themselves into Reynolds' consciousness, leaving behind a permanent stain of terror. As the siren's wailing grew louder, a sense of urgency pulsed through the scene like a heartbeat. A cold sweat drenched Reynolds' face, his breathing heavy and labored as the convoy of squad cars screeched to a halt, their wheels spitting gravel and dust into the air. A handful of uniformed officers piled out, the collective dread of their arrival adding to the already chaotic scene. Their hands reached for their holsters, fingers poised to draw their weapons, ready to unleash their training against any threat they might encounter. And yet, as their gazes fell upon The Rock, looming over a disarmed and quaking Reynolds, his authority undisputed, their reactions faltered. Captain Harris, his weathered face and silver hair betraying decades of experience, took the lead. His authoritative figure exuded a calm that was unmatched by his subordinates. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice gravelly and commanding, yet void of the malice that had tainted Officer Reynolds' words. The Rock, his focus still fixed on the officer pinned against his vehicle, slowly turned to address the new arrival. His gaze steady and unwavering, he did not deign to break his stare with the cowering Reynolds. "Ask the people recording," he growled, his words a grave reminder of the modern age's ubiquitous technology. Indeed, as if on cue, a multitude of smartphones recorded the altercation, their lenses capturing the truth of this tragic moment. The scene unfolded like a theater performance, the crowd a collective audience witnessing the fallout of Officer Reynolds' abhorrent actions. Captain Harris, his face growing darker by the second as he watched the damning footage on the bystander's phone, glanced up at the crowd, his eyes steeled with righteous anger. "Cuff him," he ordered, his words sharp as a blade. Two of his subordinates, their expressions mirroring the growing unease of the situation, swiftly moved forward, their hands gripping a pair of handcuffs. Reynolds, his shock and fear replaced with a defiant glare, attempted to resist as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. What? No. This is," Reynolds stammered. Captain Harris, his expression as impenetrable as stone, cut through the officer's protestations with a chillingly level-headed tone. "You're under arrest for excessive force and endangering a minor," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, his gaze unwavering as he stared down the disgraced officer. "You're a disgrace to the badge, Reynolds." The scene shifted as Reynolds, his hands secured behind his back, was escorted away by the police officers, his fate uncertain and his dignity in tatters. The Rock, the fury ebbing away from his frame like a storm dissipating into the horizon, turned to his little girl, kneeling down to meet her gaze. His hand, rough from years of training and countless films, gently brushed away a single tear rolling down her cheek. "You okay, baby girl?" he murmured, his voice softening to a melodic whisper, the love for his daughter palpable in the tenderness of his tone.